Somewhere in the North Atlantic, in the late 1970s, an American attack submarine is doing what American attack submarines did every day of the Cold War, silently trailing a Soviet contact. The sonar operators have the routine down to an art. Find them, follow them, log everything, stay invisible. The Soviets rarely make it difficult. Their submarines are loud, and the Americans hear them coming from miles away. But this contact is different. The trace on the screen begins to accelerate, 20 knots, 25. The American boat speeds up to follow and starts falling behind, 30 knots, 35. The American submarine, one of the finest hunting machines ever built, is now at flank speed, its reactor straining, and the gap is still growing, 40 knots, 41, 42. The Soviet contact pulls away, turns, and simply leaves, moving through the deep ocean at over 75 kilometers per hour, 47 miles per hour, underwater. The sonar operators have just met the fastest combat submarine ever built, before or since. And then comes the detail that turns astonishment into something closer to fear. The American crew runs the numbers on their own weapons. Their standard torpedo, the Mark 48, has a listed top speed of around 55 knots and limited range at that setting. Against a target doing 42 knots that can hear the torpedo coming and simply run, the intercept math barely closes. Fired from the wrong angle, from the wrong range, the torpedo doesn't catch this submarine at all. The weapon designed to kill submarines cannot reliably catch this one. NATO gave it the reporting name Alfa. The Soviets called it Project 705 Lira the Liar. And on paper, it read like science fiction, a hull made not of steel but of titanium, a metal the West struggled to weld in small pieces, formed here into an entire submarine. A nuclear reactor cooled not by water but by molten metal, liquid lead and bismuth, running hotter and denser than anything in any Western boat. A crew of around 30 men, less than a third of an American crew, running the whole ship from a single control room like the bridge of a starship. Acceleration that let it outturn and outrun torpedoes. The ability, Western analysts calculated, to chase down almost any warship on the surface of the ocean and to escape almost anything sent after it. Intelligence officers in Washington and London had spent the 1970s telling themselves the Soviet Union was a decade behind in submarine technology. The Alpha said otherwise. The Alpha said the Soviets could build things NATO could not build, and NATO's response would eventually include new torpedoes, new tactics, and a genuine, documented panic. And yet, like the MiG-25 before it, the Alpha was not what it seemed. The fastest submarine ever built was also one of the most flawed, a machine so extreme it could barely coexist with its own navy, a monster to its enemies and very nearly a monster to its own crews. This is the story of America's underwater nightmare, the 47-mile-per-hour monster, Project 705. To understand why the Soviet Union built such an extreme machine, you have to understand the deadly game being played beneath the oceans, a game most of the world never saw. By the early 1960s, the nuclear submarine had become the most important weapon on Earth. Not the most powerful, the most important. American ballistic missile submarines hid in the deep ocean carrying enough warheads to erase a country, and their entire value lay in being unfindable. Protecting them and hunting the other sides was the job of attack submarines, fast, silent hunters whose only prey was other submarines and the ships above them. In this game, the two superpowers made fundamentally different bets. The Americans bet on silence. Their boats and their British allies were engineered around one idea: the submarine that is heard first dies first. Machinery mounted on rafts to absorb vibration, propellers sculpted to whisper, crews trained to treat noise as death. The Soviets, always behind in quieting technology, bet instead on performance. Speed, depth, weapons, numbers. If NATO's boats were assassins, the Soviet fleet was a cavalry charge. There was logic to the Soviet choice, and it was rooted in geography and doctrine. The Soviet Navy's nightmare was the American Carrier Battle Group, a floating airbase surrounded by escorts able to launch nuclear strikes from the sea. Soviet naval doctrine demanded submarines that could reach those carrier groups fast before they launched, which meant sprinting across hundreds of miles of ocean. and Soviet waters themselves needed defending, the approaches to Murmansk and the bastions where Soviet missile submarines hid. What the fleet wanted was an interceptor, the naval equivalent of the MiG-25 we met earlier in this series, a machine that could sit in port or on patrol, receive a warning, and dash to a threat at impossible speed. In 1957, a Soviet engineer named Anatoly Petrov proposed exactly that, and the idea crystallized into one of the most radical requirements ever written for a warship. Project 705 was to be a small submarine, under 3,000 tons, half the size of contemporaries, with a crew cut from 100 men to a few dozen, capable of speeds above 40 knots, able to dive deeper than NATO torpedoes could follow, and quick enough in the turn to evade anything fired at it. It would be, in the words of the program's advocates, not a boat but an underwater fighter jet, scrambled like aircraft to intercept intruders. The Soviet Academy of Sciences loved it. The admirals were skeptical, sailors distrust miracles, but the program found a patron in the highest levels of the party, and in 1960s Soviet Union that settled arguments. The design bureau SKB 143, later Malachite, was told to make it real. The engineers quickly discovered that every number in the requirement broke something. 40+ knots in a small hull meant power density no water-cooled reactor could deliver. A tiny crew meant automation no Navy had ever attempted. Depth and weight targets meant steel wouldn't do. To build their underwater interceptor, the Soviets would have to reinvent the submarine 3 times over: its hull, its heart, and its crew. Start with the hull, because the Alfa's skeleton was made of a metal that, at the time, no other nation on Earth could shape at this scale: titanium. If you watched our SR-71 episode, you already know titanium's paradox. Nearly as light as aluminum, as strong as steel, immune to rust, and almost supernaturally difficult to work with. The Americans, building the Blackbird, machined titanium in small, precise pieces and cursed every one of them. The CIA had to secretly buy the raw metal from the Soviet Union, the world's dominant producer. Now consider what the Soviets themselves did with their home field advantage. They didn't machine titanium panels. They welded titanium plates, some 10 centimeters thick, into entire pressure hulls, hundreds of tons of them. Why bother? 3 reasons, each worth a war. Weight. A titanium hull saved so much mass that a small submarine could carry a huge reactor and still hit its speed targets. Depth. Titanium's strength meant the Alfa could operate far below NATO boats. Western estimates credited it with operating depths around 350 meters and a crush margin well beyond, and its titanium cousins would later go deeper than any combat submarine in history. And one more, subtle and delicious: titanium is barely magnetic. The magnetic anomaly detectors on NATO's sub-hunting aircraft, which find submarines by sensing the distortion a steel hull makes in the Earth's magnetic field, went half-blind against a titanium boat. But welding titanium isn't like welding steel. Molten titanium reacts violently with oxygen and nitrogen. Expose a hot weld to ordinary air, and it becomes brittle glass. Small parts can be welded in boxes flushed with inert argon gas. A submarine hull is not a small part. The Soviet solution, developed at the Sevmash and Admiralty yards, has passed into engineering legend. They built enormous enclosed working spaces flooded with argon and sent welders inside wearing what were essentially spacesuits, suited, sealed, breathing piped air, working hour after hour inside an atmosphere that would kill them instantly if their equipment failed. Veterans of the program described it as working on the moon, in a shed outside Leningrad. It was some of the most dangerous industrial labor of the Cold War. It consumed years, and the reject rate early on was brutal. Entire hull sections were scrapped when X-rays found brittle welds. The West watched fragments of this through intelligence and simply refused to believe the scale of it. When the CIA concluded in the 1970s that the Soviets were building complete titanium pressure hulls, parts of the U.S. Navy establishment dismissed it. American yards had studied titanium hulls and judged them ruinously impractical. The evidence settled the argument. The Soviets ultimately built not one but three titanium submarine classes, the Alfa, the deep-diving Sierra, and the record-breaking Papa class, plus the research submarine Komsomolets, which reached over 1,000 meters. Nothing comparable was ever attempted in the West. To this day, no Western Navy has ever launched a titanium-hulled combat submarine. The empire that couldn't make a decent television had, in one narrow domain, outbuilt the entire Western world. And the hull was only the second most radical thing about this submarine. The most radical thing about the Alfa was its heart, a nuclear reactor unlike anything that has ever gone to sea before or since, cooled not by water, but by molten metal. Every other nuclear submarine ever built, American, British, French, Chinese, and almost all Soviet boats, uses pressurized water reactors. Water carries heat from the core to the steam plant. It's proven, it's stable, and it has one built-in limit. To keep water liquid at high temperature, you need enormous pressure, which means thick, heavy vessels and pipes, which means a big, heavy reactor compartment. For the Alfa's designers, chasing speed in a hull half the normal size, water physics was a cage. Their escape was a coolant straight out of alchemy, a molten alloy of lead and bismuth. Liquid metal carries heat far better than water, and it does so at atmospheric pressure. No matter how hot it runs, it doesn't try to explode out of its pipes. That meant the entire reactor system could be smaller, lighter, and hotter. The Alfa's OK-550 and BM-40A reactors delivered around 155 megawatts from a package dramatically more compact than any water-cooled equivalent, a power density roughly twice that of contemporary Western marine reactors. That heart in that titanium hull is where 41+ knots came from. One reactor, one shaft, one screaming turbine, and a submarine that accelerated, Cruz said, like a car. But liquid metal coolant has a personality, and it is vindictive. Lead-bismuth freezes solid at around 125 degrees Celsius. Let the coolant cool below that anywhere in the loop, and it solidifies. The reactor's arteries fill with hardening metal, and the core is permanently entombed. A frozen liquid metal reactor is not damaged. It is dead, unrepairable, a sealed radioactive monument, which produced the Alfa's defining operational curse. The reactor could never be allowed to go cold, not in port, not during overhaul, not on holidays. Either the reactor itself idled continuously, burning out its service life at the pier, or shore facilities pumped superheated steam into the ship around the clock. The special keys built for the Alfas at Zapadnaya Litsa were as exotic as the boats, and this being the late Soviet Union, chronically unreliable. Crews lived with the knowledge that a steam supply failure over a long winter weekend could murder their ship at its moorings. At least one Alfa, K-123's sister experience aboard the class leader, and the original prototype K-64 would prove the fear justified. There was a second demon, the coolant itself, irradiated in the core, bred polonium-210, one of the most intensely radioactive substances known. A leak wasn't just a mechanical casualty, it was a contamination event. Maintenance on the primary loop meant handling pipework whose contents could kill via a speck of dust. The Americans knew all of this intimately because they had tried it first. The USS Seawolf of 1957 ran a sodium-cooled reactor. After 2 years of lakes and terror, the U.S. Navy tore it out, replaced it with water, and swore off liquid metal forever. Admiral Rickover, father of the American nuclear navy, called the technology expensive, complex, and unforgiving. The Soviets read the same physics and made the opposite bet. Speed was worth the demon. For a while, they were even right. The third reinvention was the strangest of all, and decades ahead of its time. The Alfa was designed to be run by computers, with a crew smaller than a school bus. An American attack submarine of the 1970s carried around 110 to 130 men. A comparable Soviet boat, over 80. The Alfa went to sea with roughly 30, and in the original concept, the designers had wanted 16. Almost every man aboard was an officer or senior specialist. There were hardly any ordinary sailors, because there was hardly any ordinary sailor work. The entire ship, Reactor, propulsion, weapons, sensors, damage control was managed from a single compact control center through an automated combat information system called ACORD, backed by dozens of subsystems that monitored and adjusted the machinery without human hands. In the rest of the world's navies, watchtenders roamed machinery spaces reading gauges. On the Alfa, for the first time in naval history, compartments ran unmanned, watched electronically, entered only for maintenance. Understand how radical this was in 1971. This is a submarine conceived in the era of vacuum tubes, operational before the personal computer existed, crewed at a level Western navies wouldn't approach until the 21st century. The U.S. Navy's newest attack submarines today, with 50 years of computing progress, still carry over 130 people. The Soviets did 30 in 1977 because the mission demanded it. A small, fast interceptor simply had no room for 100 bunks. Life aboard was correspondingly strange. The crew was concentrated in and around the control center, so the designers did something unprecedented. They built the entire crew area as a protected citadel, and above it, a feature no submarine had ever had, an escape capsule. If the ship was lost, the crew could, in theory, seal themselves into a pod built into the sail and ride it to the surface, all of them at once, from deep below crushed depth of any diver's reach. Western boats of the era offered their crews 2 escape hatches and a prayer. The Alfa offered a lifeboat to space capsule standards. It was tested. It worked. Other Soviet designs copied it. The automation had a darker corollary, though. 30 men can fight the ship. They cannot fight a serious casualty. Western submarines survive fires and floods through muscle, dozens of trained bodies swarming the emergency. The Alfa's philosophy was that automation would contain any casualty, and if it didn't, the crew would escape rather than fight. Soviet naval officers, whose services history is written in heroic damage control, hated this with their souls. The fleet's conservatives fought the crew-size decision for years and won compromises. The operational crew crept from 16 to around 30, plus, in practice, riders and technicians. And there was one more consequence nobody advertised. A ship this automated, this exotic, this tightly packed with novel technology could not be maintained by its crew at all. Every Alfa was, in effect, permanently tethered to factory specialists, design bureau engineers, and those temperamental shore facilities. The fighter jet submarine had fighter jet ground crews. None of that was visible to NATO in 1977. What was visible on sonar screens across the North Atlantic was terrifying enough. The West's education in Project 705 came in stages, each worse than the last. Stage 1 was the prototype. K-64, the first Alfa, commissioned in December 1971 from the Admiralty Yard in Leningrad. Western intelligence had watched something small and strange take shape there for years and had already assigned the class its NATO name. Initial glimpses raised eyebrows. The boat was tiny by nuclear standards, under 80 meters, with a smoothly faired sail and a hull so clean it looked like a concept sketch. The eyebrows went higher when the first performance rumors arrived. Then K abruptly vanished back into the yard, and by 1974 it had been cut in half. Western analysts correctly guessed a catastrophic reactor casualty. Its coolant had partially frozen, killing the plant exactly as the physics threatened, and some concluded, comfortably, that the crazy Soviet speedboat had failed and the program would die. Stage 2 destroyed the comfort. Instead of canceling, the Soviets fixed the design and put it into series production at 2 yards simultaneously. 6 more boats followed through the late 1970s and early 1980s, and when the production Alphas began operating from the Kola Peninsula, NATO's underwater surveillance network, the hydrophone arrays of SOSUS, and the trailing attack boats got their first real data. The numbers landed in classified briefings like artillery shells. Sustained speed, 41 to 43 knots, some tracks suggesting more. Acceleration from patrol speed to flank in about a minute. Turns so tight, roughly 180 degrees, in under 45 seconds at full speed, that a trailing torpedo's guidance struggled to follow. One widely reported episode from 1978 tells of an Alpha clocked while evading NATO tracking. Whether every detail is literal, the classified consensus was not in doubt, because the U.S. Naval Institute and declassified assessments say it plainly. The Alfa could outrun NATO's standard torpedoes of the day in significant parts of their engagement envelopes. Sit with that sentence, because entire NATO committees had to. The Mark 46 lightweight torpedo, dropped from aircraft and helicopters, the Alliance's most numerous anti-submarine weapon, ran at around 45 knots, against a 42-knot target that hears it splash and runs, nearly useless. The submarine-launched Mark 37 was hopeless. Even the new Mark 48 heavyweight, at 55 knots, needed favorable geometry. A stern chase against a fleeing Alfa strained its endurance to the limit. Depth made it worse. Reports credited the Alfa with diving beyond some NATO torpedo depth ratings and coming back up like an elevator. And the Alfa was loud, yes, at speed it roared like a freight train, but its designers had always intended that trade. Its game wasn't stealth, it was reaction. Sitting quietly off its own coast at low speed, it was hard enough to find. Alerted, it became effectively uncatchable, sprinting to a convoy, a carrier group, or an intruding submarine, attacking, and leaving at a speed nothing could match. In the Pentagon, in Northwood, in Brest, the same questions circulated with rising urgency. If this is what they can build now, what is coming next? The answer NATO chose would reshape Western weapons for a generation. NATO's response to the Alfa was expensive, urgent, and in hindsight, revealing because it repeated, almost beat for beat, the Foxbet panic we chronicled in our MiG-25 episode. Start with the weapons. The United States accelerated a comprehensive upgrade of its heavyweight torpedo into the Mark 48 ADCAP, advanced capability, faster, deeper running, with guidance designed for exactly the high-speed, deep, evading target the Alfa represented. The numbers tell the story, reported speeds rising towards 63 knots, depth ratings comfortably beyond the Alfa's operating envelope. Britain went further. The Royal Navy's requirement for what became the Spearfish torpedo was written explicitly around the Alfa threat. Spearfish runs at up to 80 knots, powered by a gas turbine engine, because it had to be able to run down a 43-knot submarine from any angle with margin to spare. When a weapon's speed requirement is nearly double your own fleet's fastest boat, you know exactly which enemy the specification is describing. The Americans also revived a more drastic answer, the rocket. If torpedoes couldn't chase the Alfa, missiles could ambush it. The submarine-launched SUBROC and its successors flew a nuclear depth charge over the horizon to land on the target's position faster than any submarine could clear the area. For a period in the late Cold War, part of NATO's serious answer to the Alfa was, bluntly, tactical nuclear weapons at sea. Beyond hardware, the Alfa bent minds. War planners had built NATO's Atlantic strategy on a comfortable assumption. Soviet submarines were faster than Allied merchant convoys, but slower than Allied hunters. A 43-knot boat inverted the food chain. Studies of convoy defense against Alpha-class raiders returned ugly results, and the specter of a fleet of them, 20, 30, 40, haunted force planning documents into the 1980s. American submarine designers felt the pressure too. The Los Angeles class, fast but conventional, was partly justified by the need to keep pace with new Soviet boats. The follow-on Seawolf class, the most expensive attack submarine ever built, was conceived in the years of Alfa alarm as the definitive answer to fast, deep Soviet threats. And exactly as with the MiG-25, fear inflated the object that caused it. Intelligence estimates in the worst years credited the Alfa with 45+ knots, dives to 900 meters, and imminent mass production. The class's crippling problems, the frozen prototype, the reactor tantrums, the shore infrastructure fiasco, were invisible or discounted. Worst-case logic filled the gaps, and rival budget lines fed gratefully on the result. It is genuinely difficult, reading the declassified record, to say where honest caution ended and budget theater began. Both were real, both were profitable. Here's the number that puts it all in proportion. NATO rebuilt its torpedo inventory, revised its Atlantic strategy, and shaped 2 generations of submarine design in significant part around a Soviet class that ultimately consisted of 7 boats. 7, of which, on an average day in the mid-1980s, perhaps 2 or 3 were actually ready for sea. Why so few? Because while NATO was panicking about the Alfa, the Soviet Navy was quietly discovering that it could barely live with the thing. On paper, the Soviet Navy operated 7 of the fastest submarines in history. In practice, it operated a fleet of brilliant, bad-tempered thoroughbreds that spent more time being nursed than hunting. The reactor was the heart of the problem because it could never rest. Remember the curse? Lead-bismuth coolant freezes at 125 degrees Celsius, and a frozen reactor is a dead reactor. So every Alfa in port either kept its own plant critical, burning core life and demanding a watch crew, or depended on shore steam, and the shore side of the Soviet Navy was exactly as reliable as the rest of late Soviet infrastructure. The special base facilities at Zapadnaya Litsa were late, understaffed, and prone to failure. Boats ended up keeping their reactors warm themselves for months, which is a little like keeping a racehorse fit by making it gallop in its stable all winter. When the Demon finally caught a production boat, it caught it at sea. In April 1982, K-123, the class leader, suffered a primary coolant leak while submerged in the Barents Sea. Liquid metal laced with polonium-bred isotopes escaped into the reactor compartment, where it froze onto everything it touched, entombing equipment in radioactive lead. Roughly 2 tons of alloy left the loop before the plant was shut down. The crew survived. The reactor did not. The repair, essentially cutting the submarine open and replacing the entire reactor compartment, took 9 years. K-123 returned to service in 1992, just in time for the Navy that owned it to cease to exist. The first casualty had come even earlier. K-64, the prototype, lost its plant to creeping coolant solidification within months of commissioning in 1972 and was written off after barely a year in service, becoming a training hulk split in 2. Between K-64's death and K-123's decade in the yard, the 7-boat class rarely had more than a handful of units operational. Western analysts who later saw the record's concluded availability was, by NATO standards, dismal. The crews, for their part, loved and feared the boats in equal measure. Loved because the Alfa was genuinely thrilling. Veterans describe full-power runs, the entire hull humming, depth gauge steady, speed log reading numbers no other submariner would ever see, as the peak of their careers. The automation worked better than the conservatives had predicted. The small wardroom-sized crews became elite, tight-knit clubs. Feared because everyone aboard understood the machinery's temper, and because the boat's loudness at speed meant that in a real war, every sprint would be an announcement. And the timing was cruel. The Alfa was an interceptor, a reaction weapon optimized for a war fought near Soviet bastions. But by the mid-1980s, the underwater war had changed. American boats had grown so quiet, and their listening so acute, that the contest was decided long before any sprint began. Speed you can hear coming is not power, it's a target datum. The Soviets themselves absorbed the lesson. Their next generations, the Sierra, the Aquila, kept the titanium and the automation lessons, but spent their rubles on silence. The fastest submarine ever built had been designed for a war that, by the time it worked properly, no longer existed. The end, when it came, was not dramatic. The Alfa was not defeated, not obsoleted by a rival, not lost at sea. It was, like Concorde and the SR-71 before it in this series, killed by arithmetic. Every Alfa hour at sea cost a small fortune in specialist support. Every month in port consumed reactor life or scarce shore steam. The polonium-laced coolant made every maintenance evolution a radiological event. The unique reactors demanded unique training, unique spares, unique facilities, all for 7 hulls, while the rest of the fleet ran on standardized water-cooled plants. Even refueling was an exotic operation performed at a single specialized facility, and mid-1980s plans to recore the boats with fresh reactors collided with the reality that the facilities barely functioned. Then the Soviet Union itself began to fail, and the Navy's budget failed with it. A fleet that could no longer fuel its ordinary ships had no sentiment to spare for thoroughbreds. In 1990, still before the final collapse, the decision came down. The Alphas would go. Boat after boat was withdrawn, their reactors, unrefuelable and unrestartable once cooled, allowed at last to freeze solid, sealing themselves into exactly the radioactive monuments the engineers had always feared. 6 of the 7 were struck by 1992, their reactor compartments eventually cut out and stored, floating or beached, at Seda Bay with the rest of the Soviet nuclear fleet's remains, a problem Western decommissioning money would later help manage. One boat, K-123, with its brand-new replacement reactor, lingered in service as a training platform until 1996, the last of the breed, before following her sisters to the breakers. Total service life of the fastest submarine class in history, about 19 years from first commissioning to final decommissioning, much of it spent in overhaul. The average Alfa spent more years being built and repaired than it spent operational. And yet, before we write the obituary as a failure, one uncomfortable truth deserves the floor. The Alfa did its strategic job, not the job in its specification, intercepting carrier groups. It rarely, if ever, shadowed one in anger. Its real effect was the one NATO's own documents record. It forced the West to spend billions on new torpedoes, new sensors, new submarine designs, and decades of analytical anxiety, all against 7 temperamental boats that were, on most days, tied to a pier with steam hoses attached. As a warship, the Alfa was a qualified failure. As an instrument of the Cold War's central mechanism, making the other side ruin itself preparing for you, it may have been one of the most cost-effective failures ever launched. If that argument sounds familiar, it should. It is the MiG-25 story with salt water added, an extreme, misunderstood Soviet machine whose greatest weapon was the West's imagination. The Cold War kept building this same parable over and over in titanium. But the Alfa's story doesn't quite end at the breaker's yard, because the technologies it gambled on, every single one of them, turned out to be prophecy. Here is the strangest thing about Project 705. Judged as a warship, it failed. Judged as a prediction of the future, it was right about almost everything. Prophecy 1. Automation. The Alfa's 30-man crew was marked as reckless in 1977. Today it reads as a preview. Modern navies everywhere have spent decades driving crew sizes down. Contemporary frigates sail with half the crew of their predecessors. The newest submarines automate machinery, watches the Alfa's designers would recognize instantly. And the logical endpoint, fully uncrewed combat submarines, is now an open development race. Russia's current large, torpedo-shaped nuclear drones and the U.S. Navy's extra-large unmanned undersea vehicles are, in a real sense, Alphas with the crew rounded down to 0. The Soviet engineers, who wanted a 16-man boat in 1960, weren't wrong. They were 50 years early, betting on computers that didn't exist yet. Prophecy 2. Titanium. The West never matched it, but the Soviets doubled down. The Sierra class took titanium hulls into the silent generation, and the deep-diving research boats descended past a kilometer. The metallurgy and welding mastery built for the Alfa program became a permanent, unique Russian industrial capability, one reason post-Soviet Russia could keep building deep-diving special mission submarines that still worry NATO today. Prophecy 3, the eeriest one, the reactor. Lead-bismuth cooling, the demon that killed K and crippled K-123, refused to die. The physics that made it terrifying in a 1970s submarine, compactness, high temperature, no pressurized water to explode, are exactly the virtues the civilian nuclear industry now wants. Lead-cooled fast reactors are one of the 6 official Generation 4 reactor concepts. Russia is building a full-scale lead-cooled power reactor, Brest 300, whose engineering lineage runs straight back through the Alfa program's OKB Gidropress designs. Startups in the West pitch lead-cooled microreactors with slide decks that never mention a Soviet submarine, but the operational experience they draw on, roughly 80 reactor years of it, came from Project 705 and its Shore prototypes. The only liquid metal fast reactors ever to serve in quantity anywhere, went to see inside Alphas. Even the tactical concept came back. The Alfa was scorned for being fast and loud in an age that rewarded slow and silent. But look at the modern undersea arms race. Hypersonic weapons above the water, high-speed supercavitating torpedoes below it, uncrewed vehicles that can afford to be loud because nobody dies when they're caught. Speed is returning to the ocean, carried by machines with no crews to protect. Exactly the trade the Alfa's designers were reaching for with the technology of 1960. None of this redeemed the class in its lifetime. Profits, as a rule, die broke. But when the engineering historians at Malachite wrote their retrospective, they chose a title with quiet defiance. They called the Alfa a submarine ahead of its time. NATO's assessments, written by the people paid to kill it, ended up agreeing in more grudging words. Which brings us to the final question, the one this whole series keeps asking. What do you actually do about a machine like this, and what does the fear of it cost? Let's audit the fear, because the Alfa panic, like the Foxbet panic, left receipts, and reading them tells you how the Cold War actually worked. On NATO's side of the ledger, the Mark 48 ADCAP program, billions of dollars, driven substantially by the fast deep threat requirement the Alfa embodied. The British Spearfish torpedo, a weapon literally specified to run down this one class of submarine at a development cost that strained the Royal Navy's budget for a decade. Anti-submarine doctrine rewritten, SOSUS coverage expanded. The Seawolf class, conceived with performance margins priced against Soviet boats that mostly never left port. Add the softer costs, the studies, the war games, the career-building threat briefings, and the Alfa extracted from the West, a sum that dwarfs, by orders of magnitude, what the Soviet Union spent building 7 submarines. On the Soviet side, the program consumed 2 decades of elite engineering talent, unique industrial facilities, and a mountain of rubles for a class that spent its life half-broken and was scrapped early. The follow-on it was supposed to enable, an improved Project 705 with the bugs worked out, was cancelled. The Navy took the titanium and the automation and walked away from the reactor and the interceptor concept both. So who won the exchange? Here the story turns genuinely strange. If you believe the West's spending was wasted on an inflated threat, then the Alfa was a brilliant, accidental economic weapon, and Moscow won the round. But the money NATO spent wasn't burned. It bought the ADCAP and Spearfish torpedoes that still arm Western submarines today, sensor networks that outlived the USSR, and boats so quiet they redefined the game. Fear-driven spending, it turns out, is only waste when the fear is wrong about the future. The Alfa's specific threat evaporated with the Soviet Union, but the capabilities bought to counter it became the permanent foundation of Western undersea dominance. The West armed itself against a phantom, and the arms turned out to be real. We said the same sentence about the F-15 in the MiG-25 episode, and it is not a coincidence. It is the pattern of the entire Cold War. And what of the men, the designers, Mikhail Rusanov chief among them, who fought the Navy, the ministries, and physics itself for their radical boat, mostly did not live to see their prophecies vindicated. Rusanov died in 1979, his health broken, his class of submarines already gathering its reputation for trouble. His design bureau's official history calls the Alfa his monument. The crews dispersed into a collapsing Navy. Some of their boats' reactor compartments still sit in storage at Seda Bay, radioactive and patient, outliving the country that built them by decades and counting. The polonium has long decayed. The lead-bismuth in those sealed cores froze solid the day the steam stopped, exactly as the engineers always knew it would, and will stay frozen forever. Somewhere in that image, 7 super submarines, built by space-suited welders from a metal the West couldn't shape, killed not by any enemy but by their own country's exhaustion, is the whole Soviet century compressed. So what was the 47-mile-per-hour monster, really? To NATO sonar operators in 1978, it was the contact that broke the rules, the trace that accelerated past everything, the target their torpedoes couldn't promise to catch, the proof that the enemy's engineers could still produce nightmares. To the Soviet admirals who owned it, it was a gorgeous, infuriating invalid, the fastest warship ever built, tied to a pier by a steam hose, guarded around the clock so its own blood wouldn't freeze in its veins. To the engineers, on both sides, it was and remains something close to sacred. The most extreme submarine ever constructed, a machine that took titanium, liquid metal, and automation to places no navy has dared return to in the half-century since. Its records still stand, and think about how strange that is. In every other domain, the machines of the 1970s have been left far behind, but no combat submarine built since, American, Russian, or anyone's, has matched the Alfa's speed, just as no airliner has matched Concorde and no jet has matched the Blackbird. This series keeps arriving at the same startling fact from different directions. Somewhere around the 1970s, humanity hit the top of the performance curve, looked at the price tag, and deliberately walked back down. The Alfa is the deepest data point in that pattern, literally and figuratively. We didn't forget how to build 45-knot submarines. We decided, on the evidence, that being unheard beats being uncatchable, that 7 exquisite monsters lose to 50 reliable hunters, that extreme performance is a question whose answer is usually no. But notice what no cost us and what it keeps costing. Every technology the Alfa gambled on came true later, slower, more expensively, under other flags and other names. The automation arrived as crew reduction and undersea drones. The reactor is arriving now, rebranded as the future of clean energy. The titanium expertise never stopped mattering. The Alfa is what it looks like when engineers answer a question the world isn't ready to ask yet. And the world's unreadiness, not the engineering, is what failure meant. The Cold War built 3 great speed monuments, and by accident or providence, one country's fear built all 3 of ours. The MiG-25 terrified the West into building the F-15. The Alfa terrified it into Spearfish and ADCAP and Seawolf. And the SR-71, the West's own monster, terrified the East into the MiG-25, which is where we came in. Fear, it turns out, was the Cold War's real chief engineer. The machines were just its handwriting. Today, what's left of Project 705 sits in a shipyard museum in St. Petersburg, and in those sealed compartments at Seda Bay, frozen lead where the fire used to be. Stand on the pier at Zapadnaya Litsa in winter, veterans say, and the wind off the Barents Sea sounds faintly like steam. Nothing in the ocean ever caught the Alfa. Only the 20th century could. Thanks for watching. This is the 4th film in our series on the Cold War's most extreme machines. The Concorde, MiG-25, and SR-71 films are on screen now if you missed them. Subscribe, and I'll see you below Crush Depth.